Hi, I'm Danton Rimoto. I'm a Filipino novelist, poet, short story writer, and journalist.
My name is Laurel Flores Fantuzo. I'm a dual Philippine American citizen. I'm a professor and an author.
Hello, everybody. I am Stephanie J. Alvarez. So currently, I am in Saudi Arabia. I am a writer and autobiographical writer, tackled on the OFW's diasporic writing and LGBTQ issues.
Hi, I'm Joanna Lynn Cruz, and I'm a professor. I teach at the University of the Philippines, Mindanao in Davao, and I'm an author.
My Heart Underwater is my debut young adult novel. It was published in the States in October 2020, and it follows Corazon Tagubio, who is a young, closeted Phil-Am student who is just helpless with an enormous crush on her white history teacher at her extremely conservative Catholic school. Things go wrong, and she ends up in the Philippines with a half-brother that she's never met before. I started writing the novel in 2009, and it took me about, 10 years to finish? A lot of life intervened in between. But the first thing that really haunted me in a healthy way, a healthy haunting, was Corey's voice. This incredibly anxious, frantic, demanding voice that was not my voice, that came out of very familiar feelings of anxiety and desire, but was very much itself. And so I had to spend a lot of those years thinking through who this character was, her distinctions from me, and what kind of journey she had. So my dad is Italian American. He grew up in New York State. My mom is Pinay, and she grew up in Ermita in Manila. And so I grew up very much immersed in both of those worlds. I moved to the Philippines in 2013 after grad school was done. But prior to that, I returned in 2010. I spent a month, again, like completely ill and had to leave a little bit early to recover. And then I returned for a Fulbright in 2011, where I built up my community even more, and where my mentors from Tagalog on site were still supporting me. My novel involves a lot of Tagalog and a lot of slang, and it is thanks to those teachers that the language is so present in the novel. The queer experience in the Philippines, for me, it's not something that I can speak to for everyone. But for me, I always encountered, more often than not, an extreme kind of affirmation and welcome that I felt in the Philippines even more than I did sometimes in the US. Somehow, Filipinos have a great capacity to hear the travails of your love stories or your lack of love stories that sometimes the conventions of American privacy about personal lives does not allow for. So I always found myself at these late night gatherings, sort of making confessions or, sharing longings that I found very Filipino, that were very much embraced by listeners, whether they were heterosexual or not. And usually they were wiser, older women who were just accepting me in ways that I hadn't been before. I think what makes my writing of the Philippines, I think it's that preposition. I am of the Philippines. I'm not in the Philippines right now, but I am certainly of the people of the Philippines. And many of us have been forced out of the country because of what our parents suffered economically, what our parents suffered as far as physical danger. Even now, I know there's a brain drain because of so much suffering in the country as far as horrible policies around the pandemic, horrible policies around state violence. And so if there is so much exile, we have to react against that with some radical compassion. I think that's what makes it Filipino. That's what makes my novel Filipino, I hope, is a sense of characters making mistakes, a sense of characters caught in historical legacies of economic dispossession and immigration that they might not even be aware of, but that is ultimately suffused with a kind of love. I think that's what makes my writing Filipina, Filipinx, Filipina.
I think ang autobiography ng ibang Lady Gaga or ang autobiography of the other Lady Gaga, should I say, it's at the first place, I think there's some kind of layers that I should say. It's first being a migrant worker. It's all about diasporic writing and LGBT or the trans literature. It's always this kind of quest of identity of being a migrant worker, of being a diaspora, and identity of being a trans woman. You know, the so-called, like we always saying that once you're an OFW and then you say like, okay, we are leaving our country because, to earn more money. But I think it's more than that. There's something like, if I want to quote my favorite writer also, Milan Kundera, said in The Unbearable Lightness of Being that a person who longs to live, to leave the place where he lives or where he belongs is an unhappy person. I think this time when you try to detach yourself, it's not only to to think about the point A where you belong and the point B, the new refuge or the new home, but the space between this kind of A and B is what you are trying to, this unhappiness. But it's not about the literal unhappiness. It's all about, how you describe this kind of this space between, and you try to find another space for your being, for being a Filipino. As a trans woman, especially in Saudi Arabia, it's a kind of, I think I should say some kind of risk at the same time. And I should say also it's a kind of protest.
Taong 2008 nang magpasya ako makipagsapalaran sa Saudi Arabia. At sa tulad kong trans woman na walang karapatang iwagayway ang aking pagkakakilanlan, ang pananatili ko sa gitnang silangan, kundi man katatagan ay isang tahimik na pagkapit sa paningin.
Transfinity Diary is a glimpse into my diasporic life in Saudi Arabia, the hidden trans universe of a trans woman in a conservative Islamic country. It's a love story also of a man in the time of pandemic along the temporary search for freedom amid the restriction and crisis, and staying across borders in spaces hostile to LGBTQI rights. Being here, this is what I'm trying to say, being here in a patriarchal space where I could not bear my identity is both a stand and an uncertainty. This is not only a form of resilience, but also an anchor to silent struggle and protest. It's just personal expression. But after all, this kind of challenge that you need to tell the truth. You need to speak up. And then I think writing is the most important, form of telling your life, telling your stories, telling it to the world that this is the reality, this is your truth. When I write, it's not all about also going back home or my way back home, because I always think that being a woman, I don't have a country. Being a woman, I don't need a country. Being a woman, my country is the whole world, as Virginia Woolf said. So I think this is the most important thing, that because all our experiences is universal. So we need to speak up. We need to stand for it.
I'm so happy to be here because, I took up my MPhil in publishing in Scotland so many years ago, like 35 years ago. And the teacher said, the greatest, the biggest thing in publishing is Frankfurt. It's a postmodern novel about martial law in the Philippines, but told from the point of view of a young boy in the military camp. So I think what you have is like a rite of passage novel written, I think, with humor, because many martial law novels in the Philippines, they're well written, but they're so serious. No, I think there was an element of comedy and tragedy during those times, and I tried to put that in this narrative of a young gay man growing up in a military base, no, privileged background, but there was a lot of horror going on outside the country.
So what I'm saying is, Ladlad has had an extensive effect, I think not just in Philippine literature, but in Philippine American literature. It's being required in Philippine colleges, some, and in some Phil-Am courses in the US, and queer literature. Things have changed since then, which is good, no? I'm now reading a book for another publisher. I'm the reader. This is a thick compendium of LGBTQ writing. It now includes transgender literature, because in Ladlad in 1994 we had no transgender writers. In 1996 and in 1998 there were still no transgender writers. So in the new books on LGBTQ writing, I'm happy to note there are now transgender writings. And I'm so happy that they're not using the old technique of bashing the old writers, because before, when new writers write about old topics, they bash the old works. Now when they have new books about LGBTQ literature, they give a paragraph or two to Ladlad. That's okay though, because you cannot deny that we started it. In Asia, we began the first gay anthology in 1994. Nobody was doing this in 1994.
Last year, my memoir was published. It's called Abinako, or So I Thought, and it's published by the University of the Philippines Press. And it's the first lesbian memoir published in the Philippines. It took me 10 years to live it and write it. And it took 2 years before it finally came out. I think one of the queer things about the lesbian experience in the Philippines is that we don't have a word for it, like a native word for it. So if you ask common folk what they call lesbians in the Philippines, they would say tomboy. And of course, it comes from the English, the English tomboy, which means a mannish or a boyish actions, no? Or a girl who acts in a boyish manner. So in the same vein, the Philippine tomboy is likely a mannish lesbian. So, or a masculine, a butch, no? A butch identifying or butch acting lesbian. And so some lesbians in the community who do not, embody or perform the masculine form of the lesbian will reject that term, and understandably, because it's so the expectations of the community around these terms, it's loaded. They're really loaded with prejudice, for example. So you would understand lesbians who do not want to use that term because they don't want to live or deal with the stereotypes and the prejudice associated with the term. And so a lot of like the feminine identifying lesbians would say, what do you call, we don't want to be called a tomboy because we're not tomboy. And so we have the term lesbiana. So they say that the term lesbiana is preferred by lesbians who have more education, because it comes from, again, it's derived from the English lesbian. The lack of a word for it allows us to explore our identity, our evolving identities as lesbians more freely. The fact that we don't have a word for it, I think, allows each lesbian writer to express this this process, no, of becoming. Okay? How do how do you become a lesbian in the Philippines? And in fact, it's like a verb, no? Lesbianing in the Philippines. I would love to read that. I mean, if I were a lesbian, for instance, from a different country, I would be interested in how lesbians in the Philippines verb the word lesbian, no, lesbianing, and so that's what you will see in the anthology. There are, of course, some pieces that that revolve around the sexual experience necessarily, but there are also pieces in the anthology that are about political choices, or even relationship with food or fruit, that can be considered a very specific way of lesbianing. The community is stronger now. It's louder now. There's the pride movement. Today you have permission actually to be proud of it. And you have this whole community around you that have already gone through the process and will, support you along the way. It's amazing.